Okay, welcome to Mr. Wilson Teaches Watercolor Basic Techniques. Today I'm going to go through a lot of different styles of watercolor. These are for beginners, and as you do these you'll get better at them and learn exactly how much water to paint ratio, what the paper will do to it. All those things will come in time as you practice them. So it's a basic system. I'm going to show you how to tape these out. We're going to do them one by one. Some of the supplies you'll need. So this is watercolor paper. This is the good stuff that holds without warping too much. But because it's a basic introduction, if you want to use cheaper paper, that's fine. Just be careful that you test the masking tape will actually come off of it when it's wet, because a lot of times the paper will rip, and that is very frustrating. So I've got watercolor paper. I've got a basic watercolor set. I've got a variety of brushes, but for this I'll probably end up just using a regular flat brush. So this is my flat brush that I'll be using. This is a size 10 millimeter, but you're welcome to pretty much work with whatever size you like. I've got water and a water cup. Some other supplies you'll need is masking tape. I've got salt, a oil pastel, a straw, and some rubbing alcohol. So those are all the different things that we're going to be using for this demo. So hopefully you enjoy. Give it a try, tell us if you like it, and subscribe. Thank you. Okay, so the first step on trying all these different watercolor techniques is we're just going to lay down some tape to give us our different areas. I'm going to start just by splitting it in half basically, and I'm making 12 different ones, so I'm going to go through and split this up into fourths. Let's see. I'm making some of these different size just because some of them look better if we give them a little more space. Alright, so there's our 8, and then one go right across again. So some of ours we're going to have more room, some are going to have less. I'm going to give it a border as well. And this is just regular masking tape. You can use painter's tape as well. Okay, so I've split this into 12 different areas. So we're going to go through some of the techniques together using the watercolors, and some of these as you paint you'll figure out your own adaptation of it, but the majority of these are pretty common. So I would consider these introductory. So when you're using watercolor, this is just a basic praying watercolor set. I'm going to start just by laying out some color. So by adding the water, picking up some of the pigment. You can do this on a separate palette or right on the other side. And then I also usually have a tester paper where I figure out how dark this is going to be, but after you do this well you can pretty much figure out if it's going to be strong or not, accounting for the paper behind it to show some white. So the first thing we're going to do is just a flat wash. A flat wash is where you're making the paper completely saturated with this watercolor and trying to get it as consistent as possible. I'm going to hold it up to the side a little bit. So it's called a flat wash because as you can see it's a flat color. And depending on your paper, you gotta be careful how much water you're putting in, how much you're pressing down. And then I can go through and smooth it out, take any of these big blobs, or spread them out. And that's your flat wash, so just a solid color. Pretty common. and probably the easiest of all of them. Next we're going to do a gradient. So a gradient is where the water is slowly being added to the color so that it goes from really dark to really light. So basically like a value scale. Let's darken this up to start. I'm going to turn the paper here. I'm going to start by using the darkest tone. I'm going to add some water to it. Add some water to it. Add some water to it. And slowly, as you work your way down, you release all that color out. You can also go back through and darken it up as this dries. It'll allow you to soak some more color up. You can go through and try to smooth it out. So you can see our gradient is going from dark to light. So just by adding water to it, we can create that darkness to lightness one after the other. The next one is going to be wet on wet. So I'm going to start by laying down some water first. So I've tinted this with a little bit of blue. You can choose whatever color to sort of start with, but I like giving it a little bit just so I know where I painted. So I've got a saturated area. Now I'm going to pick up another pigment. I'm going to let this diffuse in. You can see because there's so much water already in there, it's going to just easily spread and sort of go through. This is good for if you're doing something like a hazy sky or you want there to be a lot of movement in the paint. You can create that effect just by adding it in right with the water already. Right, the next one we're going to do is adding salt. I'm going to start by putting in some pigment, wetting it on there. And this really only shows up when it's dry, so I'll talk about this one a little later when we go back to it. I'm going to start just by adding the pigment on, getting some salt into your hand. I'm just going to sprinkle a little bit onto there. Probably saw right in the film where they're showing up, and then I'll do a close-up later so you can see what the salt's actually doing. But as this dries, it's going to leave some white spots, so that salt's going to soak it all in. You're going to lose that. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next four in just a second. Alright, the next one we're doing is an alcohol spray. This one, the rubbing alcohol inside of this is going to basically make the paint sort of bead away from it. So as I put this color down, I'm just starting with basically a flat wash, giving it a little couple areas. And I'm going to be taking the alcohol. This is alcohol prepped into it. Just going to cover up the rest of my paper just to make sure I don't accidentally get it anywhere else. You can do this a couple different ways. You can splatter it, you can spray it, you can drip it on, you can paint with it. I'm just using a basic spray, and I'm going to see if that works. I use this a lot for some of my acrylic paintings. You can see how it's separated it out there and slowly going to dry in that pattern. So a lot of times when I'm trying to get a water effect, clouds, texture, I'll spray it with some alcohol. Okay, next we're going to do a lift. So a lift is when you're actually removing the paint from the surface. I'm going to start by laying down our color. We're doing basically a flat wash. Should do a little bit of a gradient, so I'll add a little bit more on the top here. And then using a paper towel or tissue, I'm just going to pull out some of the color. So this is a really common technique for doing clouds as well. I can lift it right off the surface and create that diffusion between the colors. So a lot of times when you want a really cloudy sky or you want some of that texture showing up through your landscapes, you'll use a lift, and that's a really quick way of doing it. Next we're going to move on to some dry brush. So dry brush is where you're picking up the color. You're basically getting rid of all of the pigment. So on a separate sheet here, I'm going to get rid of some of that, and I'm going to bring this across the paper, and it's called dry brush because it's exactly like it sounds like. You're brushing with the dry brush, so it's just got the pigment, it doesn't have a lot of water on it. This is good for fur, this is good for a lot of different texture pieces. You can also dry brush multiple colors on it. Let's pick up some purple and do the same thing. We're going to dry brush some purple right into it. And a lot of textural surfaces will have that look, so a dry brush look to it. Alright, next is going to be a wax resist. So wax resist is when you're using a crayon or something wax-based. It's an oil pastel. And you start by drawing onto the surface. So the idea is the wax becomes almost a binder between the paper and the watercolor, so that when you start to watercolor on top of this, it won't pick up on that certain area. So a lot of people do drawing first, and they'll go through and add the watercolor, and that will prevent it from hitting that surface there. You can also use rubber cement for this, anything that sort of seals the paper, so that when you paint onto it, it then reveals itself. Alright, the next couple ones are different techniques. One of them is going to be glazing. That requires it to be dry. So I'm going to go ahead and start that one first, even though I won't actually finish it right away. So I'm going to start just by drawing a couple stripe patterns into here. And we're going to come back to this one. So there's my future glaze one. So I just got that one started. In the meantime, we're going to do a gradual change, a color change, so graded change. We're going to start with our blue. And then I'm going to dip it in the purple. Going back into the purple. Each time I'm dipping it into this purple, you can see the color slowly changing to the dark blue to the dark purple. That's a gradient change, so we went from the dark blue to the purple just by adding color in. The next one we're going to be doing some straw technique. So this is a way of basically creating different patterns. So for this I usually get blobs of color. We'll lay it onto the paper. Using a small straw, we're going to blow into it. So a lot of times when I do something like a tree, fireworks, different plant life, let's say I want these all sort of come up. You can sort of control the pattern based off of which way you're blowing. You can also do a breath right down on the top to make them explode a little bit. Start in here and go right dead center. And then they'll go in all different directions. So depending on how much you mess around with this, it does make some abstract lines, but it's pretty neat seeing all the different ways that the air can control it. And the next one is splatter. I'm going to try a splatter piece. I'm just going to cover up some of these side ones. And for the splatter, this works good with a toothbrush, but basically any sort of brush that can hold a lot in it. You can control the splatter, so this is using my finger. And usually the lighter the hit, the less you'll get. If you want a lot, you can really slam down onto it. That's your basic splatter paint. A lot of people would do that on top of some of their other colors. So if they wanted to add areas of depth, they'll add a shadow by doing some splatter onto it, which will create texture and a color change. And we're going to go back to our glazing. So now that I've got my blue down there, I'm going to make a light purple. So stick sort of the same colors we've been using. So this is called glazing. Glazing is where you're adding a layer of another color right on top. So again, a lot of people do this for shading as well. So I'm just going to show you the difference. So next I'm going to go right over the area I already had. So it will change the background while leaving the original blue there. That creates a glaze effect or a different color change. And the last one I'm going to show you is just a light lift. So if you wanted to lift off some color, we're going to go back to our original one. Actually take my brush, I can re-wet an area. As I push this paint out of the way, it's slowly going to lift out the color and bring back some of that paper there. Really be able to lift one of the colors right out. I'll bring this up a little closer. So a lot of times we'll use this for when we're making a moon, a sun, or a different light source, highlight. I'll also show you how that salt's drying so you can see the crystallization that's happening with the salt area. We'll just do a close-up of each of them as we go through. These are what the finished ones look like. Then we're going to fast forward to me taking the tape off, and we're going to show you what they look like when they're dry. Okay, so here's our finished one. I just took the tape off. I'm now going to go ahead and label these, and I'll show you a finished version of this too, so you can do the same as well. So I'll use this sheet as a reference. So this first one here again, let's use the bigger side actually so you can see this from the camera. It's called a flat wash. Next one is called a gradient. This was our wet on wet. This one was our salt. This next one was the rubbing alcohol. Here's our lifting. Our dry brush. Wax resist. Let's see, this next one was our graded color. And we had our straw blowing, our splatter, and last was our glazing. You're going to go ahead and label it the same.